Hello, this is Eva. I'm a member of the Ecological Restoration team at Acacia Environmental Management. This presentation has been created for Yarra Riverkeeper volunteers and Acacia staff who'll be working along the suburban stretches of the river. In this video, I'll take you through some common weeds you'll find along the Yarra, how to identify them, and how to treat them. The Yarra Riverkeeper Association and Acacia Environmental Management would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Birrarung and its environs, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. One very common weed you'll find along the banks of the Yarra is Tradescantia, or wandering creeper. It's a trailing, succulent perennial with stems that root at nodes and small white three-petaled flowers. You'll find trad in damp, shady places along the riverbank, and its tendency to form really thick carpets makes it a serious problem as it shades out all the other understory species. If you're hand weeding trad, make sure to pull it gently and not snap the stem, and hang it in a tree or remove it from sight when you're done, as any stems left on the ground can regrow roots at the nodes. We can also chemically treat trad by spraying it with styrene. Angled onion is another common weed of damp areas along the riverbank. Often you'll find it growing among grasses. The most distinct identifying feature of angled onion is its garlicky smell. You'll often smell it before you see it. It has long, fleshy leaves with a channel running down the center and white, bell-shaped drooping flowers. Be careful that you don't confuse it for bulbine or chocolate lilies that come up in spring and can look similar before they flower. When hand weeding angled onion, make sure you dig under it to get the bulb, otherwise it'll just resprout. In spring, you can also spray it with metmac, which kills the bulb. Angled onion is an edible weed. It has a subtle spring onion flavor, but be very careful that it hasn't been sprayed and isn't growing in a polluted environment. Fumaria is a delicate, trailing or climbing herb with a white or pink inflorescence. This one's a bit of a nuisance because it'll climb all over natives and shade them out. Fumaria is very easy to hand weed or chemically treat with any herbicide that kills broadleaves. Some of the most common grassy weeds you'll find along the river, both in the damp soil near the banks and further away in drier areas, are members of the Yarra genus. You'll often see these guys coming up first to colonize disturbed sites. The leaf blades are bright green and generally fairly short and wide. Yarra longiflora, on the left, has a drooping, spiky seed head and reddy purple bits where the leaf blade joins the stem. Yarra erecta, on the right, has an erect seed head with little round seeds. Sometimes it can be confused with the native grass Microlina stipoides, as they often grow together. I talk about Microlina in my other presentation about indigenous species of the Yarra. One easy way to tell whether you're dealing with a weedy or native grass without the seed head present is to give it a bit of a tug. Ehata and many other weedy grasses are shallow-rooted annuals, so they'll easily come out. Microlina and almost every other indigenous grass in Greater Melbourne is perennial, so it's deeply rooted and won't come out easily. We usually treat Ehata with glyphosate or the grass-specific herbicide Fusilade. Oxalis is a bit of an all-rounder. It'll grow in wet and dry places. It has characteristic heart-shaped leaflets and bright yellow flowers. The stems have a bitter lemony taste, but that's probably not the best way to ID them. Oxalis grows from a bulb, so it can be a bit tricky to hand weed. If you don't pull out the bulb, it'll grow right back. We also spray it with metmac, which kills the bulb. Sweet fernel is a weedy grass you can find along the riverbanks and in drier areas up the slope. It's a tufted bluey-green tussock with a densely spiked inflorescence that has small white hairs. Another identifying feature is the strong sweet smell the roots give off. It's pretty intense. Some people love it and some people hate it. This one can be quite hard to hand weed once it's established, as it's a perennial grass, so it has deep roots. We can spray it with non-selective chem like glyphosate or grass-specific chem like Fusilade. You probably all know what blackberry looks like, and if you've ever had to treat it, I'm sure you also know it's a nightmare. Blackberry is a sprawling, prickly shrub with woody canes that root at the tips. It's nasty in a lot of ways. It has a habit of getting into waterways, it forms enormous thickets that crowd out everything else, and it's incredibly spiky. There's a bit of a knack to hand weeding blackberry. Firstly, you'll want to wear thick leather gloves, as the spines go right through regular garden gloves. You can't really pull it out by the roots unless it's very small. So what we do is cut through the bulbous bit in the ground where all the canes join, called the corm, and dab it with some concentrated glyphosate. Make sure to hang up any canes in a tree, as they can form roots again if they're in contact with the ground. When it's actively growing, we can spray blackberry with Garlon or Metmac. One last thing to be aware of is that blackberry can look very similar to our native raspberry, Rubus parvifolius, and they can sometimes grow right next to each other. The raspberry, shown on the right, has smaller, brighter green leaves. They're less oval looking and more deeply toothed, and if you look on the underside, they are silver and velvety, whereas blackberry leaves are just a dull bluey green on both sides. Bridal creeper is a delicate, twining climber with glossy leaves that are pointed at the tips. You can find it in damp and dry places. It can be quite hard to handweed as it has a thick mat of underground tubers that you need to make sure you remove and hang up somewhere. Otherwise, we spray it with Metmac, which kills the tubers. Be careful not to confuse bridal creeper with the native climber Clematis microphylla, as they like to hang out in the same areas. I talk about clematis in my video on indigenous species of the Yarra. Spear thistles and various other thistles are common along the Yarra. Spear thistles are recognizable by their showy purple flower heads. You can identify the young plant as a spiky, velvety blue-green rosette, and the leaves are fairly flat and oval. As it grows, the stem shoots up to be quite tall. I've seen thistles as tall as me, and the leaves become deeply toothed. When hand weeding spear thistles, you might want to wear leather gloves as they're pretty spiky. You can hand weed the young ones. Make sure to get the deep taproot though. When they're larger, we cut spear thistles at the base and dab them with glyphosate. Cassinia sifton is an example of a native species that can act as a weed, because they have a tendency to get out of control in disturbed sites and form big thickets that outcompete other natives. This one you'll probably be dealing with if you work at Westerfolds Park. You can identify Cassinia sifton as a slender shrub that has sparse hairy foliage and a spicy aroma when you crush the leaves. They are generally pretty easy to hand weed.